She said it quietly, almost kindly, as if the words weren't meant to cut. "You're nothing like my mother." The room fell silent, and in that pause, something in me finally shifted. I had spent years trying to be steady, gentle, and present in a house where love often felt conditional. We lived in a narrow home filled with inherited habits, old silences, and expectations that were never spoken aloud. That night, under a dim ceiling light and the weight of unspoken history, a long-buried truth finally surfaced. The ceiling fan was turning slow, clicking once every rotation, like it was counting something I'd forgotten. Morning light leaned against the curtains but didn't come all the way in. She stood near the sink, rinsing a cup that was already clean. Then she said it, softly, almost thoughtfully. "You're nothing like my mother." She didn't look at me when she said it. And somehow that made it stay. It wasn't an argument. That's what confused me most. No raised voices. No sharp edges. Just an ordinary morning that smelled faintly of soap and yesterday's coffee. I was sitting at the table, scrolling without reading, pretending my thoughts were elsewhere. The house felt calm, the way it does right before something changes. Her tone wasn't angry. It was observational, like she was commenting on the weather. That calmness gave the words weight. If she had shouted, I could have defended myself. If she had laughed, I could have brushed it off. But this felt measured. I'd lived in this house long enough to know its moods. I knew which floorboard complained under pressure. I knew how the walls held sound, how silence stretched between sentences. That morning the silence widened. I thought about all the small moments that led here. The stories she told about her mother. How often her name came up in casual conversation. How the past always seemed brighter in her telling, sharper, more certain. I used to listen politely, nodding, learning where I fit in the margins of those stories. I told myself comparisons were harmless. People compare. It's human. But standing there, listening to water run over porcelain, I felt something old stir in my chest. Something tired. She dried her hands slowly, like she was in no rush to continue. I watched the way she folded the towel, neat and precise. That, too, reminded me of her mother, at least the version I'd been told about. "You're different," she added, still not looking at me. Different. The word hung there, unfinished. I waited for more. Some explanation. Smile. Anything to soften it. But nothing came. The fan kept clicking. Outside, a scooter passed, then disappeared. I thought of all the times I'd heard similar things, dressed up differently. She would have handled this better. My mother never worried about things like that. She always knew what to do. They were never meant to hurt. I know that now. But they stacked themselves quietly over time, like dust you don't notice until it's thick. I opened my mouth, then closed it. My throat felt tight, like I'd swallowed something dry. I looked down at my hands. They were resting flat on the table, steady. I noticed a small stain in the wood I'd never paid attention to before. "How long?" I asked finally. She turned then, just slightly. "How long what? How long have you been thinking that?" I paused. Just a second too long. Her eyes moved away again. "I don't know," she said. "A while, I guess." While. That meant this moment had been rehearsed in her head. It meant these words had waited their turn. Something shifted then. Not loudly, not all at once. It was quiet. Like a door closing gently somewhere inside me. I realized this wasn't about one sentence. It was about years of trying to fit into a shape that was never meant for me. About learning someone else's history so well that I forgot to protect my own. I thought of her mother, not as a rival, but as a shadow that had always stood between us. Strong, capable, unreachable. I had respected that woman without ever meeting her. But respect had slowly turned into measurement. I looked at her face, really looked. There was no cruelty there. Just expectation. Habit. Comfort in comparison. "I wasn't trying to be," I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. She frowned, confused. "Trying to be what?" "Her." The word settled between us. She exhaled through her nose, like she hadn't considered that possibility. Like it had never crossed her mind that I might feel that way. "I didn't mean it like that," she said. He nodded. I believed her. And still it hurt. Because meaning isn't the same as impact. And intention doesn't erase repetition. I felt the urge to smooth it over, to say it was fine. I'd done that before. Many times. But something held me back. The silence, maybe. Or the way the light had shifted, finally touching the edge of the table. For the first time, I didn't rush to fill the space. She went back to the sink, picked up another cup. The water ran again. Life continuing as it always does. I stayed where I was. The fan kept clicking. The house listened. I didn't know what this moment would become. I didn't know if she would understand, or if I would find the right words later. All I knew was that something had been named. And once something is named, it can't be unheard. I watched the light move across the floor, slow and patient. And for the first time I wondered what would happen if I stopped being compared and started being seen. The mirror in the hallway had a thin crack running through its corner, like it had survived something quietly. I stopped in front of it that morning not to look at myself, but because my feet didn't move right away. The house was still. Even the clock had paused between ticks. I remember thinking how strange it was. How a place could feel full and empty at the same time. That was when the question returned, uninvited. Had I ever been enough here? I learned early how to measure myself without realizing I was doing it. Not with numbers or words. Just with glances, pauses, tone. It happened in kitchens and living rooms. Over meals that tasted fine but felt unfinished. Her mother's name floated through those spaces often. Not loudly. Not proudly. Just present. She used to wake up before dawn. She never complained. She always knew what needed to be done. The stories came wrapped in admiration. I listened the way you're supposed to. Quiet, respectful, absorbing. I nodded at the right moments. Smiled when expected. I told myself I was just learning about the family I'd joined. But slowly, the stories began to lean toward me. Not directly. Never directly. They hovered, waiting for me to notice the distance between who I was and who she had been. I started adjusting without thinking. Waking earlier. Speaking less. Carrying things I didn't need to carry. I thought that was love. Becoming lighter so someone else wouldn't have to. The house encouraged it. The walls had a way of holding expectations, of making you feel watched even when you were alone. I could feel it when I stood at the sink, when I folded laundry, when I hesitated before sitting down. I told myself it didn't matter. That comparison was harmless. That everyone did it. But the body remembers things the mind tries to ignore. The first time I realized I was being compared, it was years ago. Small moment. Almost nothing. We were visiting her aunt. The afternoon was warm, the air thick with dust and conversation. Someone mentioned her mother. How she used to manage everything effortlessly. I laughed politely like everyone else. Then her aunt looked at me and said, "Well, everyone's different." She meant it kindly. I know that now. But I felt the sentence land unfinished. Everyone's different from her. That night, lying awake, I replayed the moment over and over. The way the room had gone quiet. The way my chest tightened. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was being sensitive. I became very good at that, explaining my own feelings away. Over time, the invisible standard became clearer. It lived in routines. In expectations that were never spoken but always enforced. I could feel it when I rested too long. When I said no. When I did something simply because I wanted to. Her mother wouldn't have done that. The thought slipped in so easily it felt like my own. I didn't resent her mother. Not really. I respected the woman she had been. But respect slowly turned into pressure. And pressure has a way of reshaping you without asking. Kept trying. Trying to be steadier, quieter, more useful. I thought if I learned the rules well enough, I would stop feeling out of place. But the feeling stayed. Standing in front of that cracked mirror, I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Not failure. Not weakness. Exhaustion. I looked older than I remembered. Not in years, just in posture. In the way my shoulders curved inward, like they were bracing for something. That's when it hit me. I had been living as if approval was something I could earn. As if love was a test I hadn't studied hard enough for. Every comparison, spoken or implied, had taught me to shrink just a little more. And the worst part was this. No one had ever asked me to disappear. I had volunteered. The realization didn't come with anger, just a quiet grief. For the version of myself that believed being different meant being lesser. For the years I spent trying to reach a standard that wasn't built for me. I touched the edge of the mirror. The glass was cool, solid, real. I thought about her mother again, not as a measuring stick, but as a person. A woman shaped by her own time, her own struggles. I understood then that she hadn't been perfect, just human, just remembered kindly. And I wondered, had anyone ever allowed me to be remembered as I was? I stepped back from the mirror. My reflection didn't change, but something inside me did. That evening I sat alone in the living room. The light faded slowly, turning the walls soft and blue. The house made its usual sounds, settling, breathing, remembering. I didn't rush to fill the quiet. I let it sit with me. For the first time I didn't ask myself how I compared. I didn't measure. I didn't adjust. I just existed. Somewhere down the hall I heard movement. Life continuing as it always does. But I stayed where I was, steady in my chair. Because learning to be enough doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it begins with stopping the count. The house sounded different at night. Not louder, just clearer. Every creak traveled farther. Every breath felt like it had somewhere to go. I sat on the edge of the couch with the lights off, watching the reflection of the window turn dark. Outside, a dog barked once and stopped. Inside, the walls seemed to lean in like they were listening. I had lived here long enough to know its noises. But that night they didn't belong to me. They felt borrowed. Like I was walking through someone else's memory. I had followed the same routines for years without questioning them. Shoes by the door. Keys on the hook. Cup stacked just so. They were small habits, easy to learn, easier to keep. First, they made me feel included. Like I had found my place inside the shape of this house. But that night, every routine felt rehearsed. Like I was playing a role I'd memorized too well. I walked through the room slowly. The hallway rug muted my steps. The walls carried faint shadows from the streetlight outside, stretching and shrinking as cars passed. The furniture stood where it always had, but it looked staged, carefully placed, carefully chosen. Nothing here reflected me. Not really. Her mother's presence lived in the house without ever showing her face. In framed photos. In inherited chairs. In the way certain objects were never moved. I had learned not to ask why. Some things were sacred simply because they were old. I paused near the bookshelf and traced a finger along the spines. Books I hadn't chosen. Margins filled with someone else's handwriting. Advice underlined long before I arrived. I wondered when the house had stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling like instruction. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Steady. Unemotional. I envied that sound. It didn't have to adjust itself to belong. I sat at the dining table alone. The same one where I'd nodded through countless conversations. The chair creaked when I leaned back like it recognized the weight of someone else. I placed my hands flat on the surface and waited. I wasn't sure for what. The echoes came quietly. Not voices exactly. More like impressions. Phrases I'd heard repeated over the years. You should do it this way. That's not how we usually handle things. She would have known better. They weren't said aloud now. They didn't need to be. The house remembered them for me. I looked around and tried to see what she saw when she stood here. What she expected to see. I imagined her mother moving through these rooms. Decisive, certain, belonging completely. The house made sense with her in it. It had been built around her habits, her silences, her authority. Where did that leave me? I stood and opened a cabinet at random. Inside were plates I rarely used. Too precious. too tied to stories that weren't mine. I closed the door gently, like I was afraid of waking something. In the bedroom, the closet smelled faintly of lavender. Her mother's scent, passed down in sachets tucked into corners. I had never asked to remove them. It felt disrespectful. But standing there, breathing it in, I felt like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The ceiling fan clicked once every few seconds. The floorboard near the door creaked like it remembered footsteps heavier than mine. I whispered just to hear my voice. Sounded small. That was when the question surfaced. Not loudly, not all at once. Just a thought that refused to pass. What parts of myself had I been silencing to fit in here? I thought about the things I used to do without hesitation. The way I laughed. The way I spoke my mind before measuring the room. The way I chose comfort over approval. Those pieces hadn't disappeared. They just learned how to stay quiet. I realized the house hadn't asked me to change. I'd done that on my own. Slowly, carefully, piece by piece. The echoes weren't only hers. Some of them were mine. I stood and walked back into the living room. The couch sagged slightly under my weight, shaped by years of someone else sitting just so. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, and let the quiet settle. For the first time, I didn't rush to correct myself. I didn't adjust my posture. I didn't wonder how I looked or whether I was doing this right. I let the house hear me breathing. There was grief in that moment, but also clarity. The house wasn't rejecting me. It was indifferent. It held whatever was placed inside it. And for years, I had placed only the parts of myself that felt acceptable. I looked around again, softer this time. The walls didn't judge. The furniture didn't expect. They just existed. The realization landed gently. I didn't need to erase myself to belong. I needed to decide what belonging actually meant. Later I turned off the lights one by one. Each click felt deliberate. The house grew darker, quieter. In the final room I paused before flipping the switch. The shadows looked different now. Less watchful. More still. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the hum, the creaks, the echoes slowly fading into background noise. Somewhere inside me something stirred, soft, unfinished. I turned off the light and walked down the hallway, my footsteps no longer trying to match anyone else's. And as the house settled around me, I wondered what it would sound like when I finally let myself be heard. The photograph sat on the top shelf, slightly tilted, catching dust more than light. I had passed it 100 times without stopping. That morning, I stood there longer than usual, staring up at a woman I had never met but somehow knew too well. Her eyes in the picture were steady, certain, like the world had already agreed with her. I wondered how many decisions had been made under that gaze, and how many of mine had been quietly measured against it. Her mother existed in pieces, never all at once, always in fragments that surfaced when the moment called for them. Strength spoken like a rule, sacrifice framed as virtue, authority worn like a coat that never came off. She held everything together. She never asked for help. She didn't tolerate excuses. The stories were told without bitterness, often with pride, sometimes with longing. I listened the way you listen to legends, aware that truth and memory had blended into something polished by time. First I admired her. Who wouldn't? A woman who endured, who provided, who stood firm when others wavered. I imagined her hands always busy, her back always straight. I imagined a life that allowed no softness because there was no room for it. I understood why that image mattered. When someone grows up inside a shadow like that, it shapes the light they expect to see. It becomes a reference point, compass. But slowly admiration turned into distance. I noticed it in small things. The way certain choices were praised while others were tolerated. The way silence was sometimes mistaken for strength. The way rest felt like weakness. I began to feel like I was auditioning for a role that had already been cast. The house, the habits, the expectations, they all seemed arranged around someone who was no longer there. And I was careful not to disturb them. One afternoon we were cleaning out a drawer together. It was an ordinary task. Uneventful. She pulled out a folded cloth, yellowed at the edges. "My mother used to keep this here," she said. She held it gently like it might still be warm. She believed in keeping things where they belonged. He nodded. Course she did. She glanced at me then, not sharply, just briefly. Her eyes moved over me like she was checking alignment. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. I wanted to ask questions. About the woman behind the stories. About her fears. Or doubts. But the stories never left room for that. They were polished, complete, finished. Instead I said, "She sounds very strong." She smiled. But not with her eyes. She had to be. The drawer stayed open between us, empty now. Small space waiting to be filled. That's when it hit me. Quietly, unmistakably. I wasn't being compared to a person. I was being compared to an ideal. And ideals don't bend. They don't listen. They don't make space. I realized then that no matter what I did, I would always fall short of a memory that had been perfected by time. That night, I lay awake thinking about her mother, not as a symbol, but as a woman. I wondered what she had lost to become so strong, what she had swallowed to keep going, what softness she had buried so others could stand. For the first time I felt compassion instead of pressure. And with that compassion came clarity. I was never meant to replace her. Not her strength. Not her role. Not her legacy. The comparison had never been fair, to either of us. I was living. She was remembered. I turned on my side and stared at the wall. The paint was chipped in places, imperfect. I liked that about it. It told the truth. I thought about all the moments I had held back, afraid of disappointing a ghost. All the times I had quieted my own instincts to match someone else's rhythm. Did she ever see me as my own person? Or only as a variation that didn't quite match the original? The question hurt, but it also freed something. Because I understood then. Being unseen isn't the same as being unworthy. Sometimes it just means the other person is looking backward instead of forward. I didn't resent her admiration. I didn't resent her grief. I resented the silence it asked of me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I didn't have to compete with memory. The next morning I passed the photograph again. The dust still rested on the frame. The woman's eyes remained steady, unchanging. I didn't stop this time. I walked past it and opened the window instead. Fresh air filled the room, moving the curtains slightly. The house breathed differently with the window open. Somewhere behind me I heard footsteps. Familiar. Careful. I stayed where I was, looking out at the street, at a world that didn't know her mother's name, and didn't need to. As the air brushed against my face, I wondered what it would take for her to see me not as a comparison, but as a presence. The clock over the stove ticked unevenly, like it had learned a bad habit and couldn't stop. I stood there rinsing my hands, watching the water run clear, then cloudy, then clear again. She sighed behind me, not loudly, not meant for attention. Just a breath released too quickly. I dried my hands slowly, as if time could stretch if I asked it to. In that pause I felt it again, the ache that comes from things too small to name but too frequent to ignore. I used to believe pain arrived loudly, that it announced itself with raised voices or slammed doors. But what I learned in that house was different. Pain often wore softer shoes. It entered quietly and took a seat. It was in the jokes said with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. In the sighs when I chose the wrong words. In the pauses that followed my opinions, as if the room needed time to recover. None of it felt intentional. That's what made it last. I told myself this was normal. That relationships came with friction. That I was too sensitive, too attentive to tone. I adjusted. I always adjusted. Felt easier than asking for explanation. Days passed in patterns. Mornings careful. Evenings measured. I learned when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. I learned how to read disappointment before it was spoken. I learned how to apologize without being asked. The house rewarded that behavior. Things stayed calm when I stayed small. But calm can be deceptive. It can feel like peace when it's really avoidance. I didn't notice the resentment at first. It arrived quietly, like dust settling on a shelf you don't use anymore. One day, you wipe your finger across it and realize how long it's been there. It was the little things that stayed with me. The way she'd raise an eyebrow when I laughed too loudly. The way she'd say, "It's fine," and mean the opposite. The way my choices were met with silence instead of support. Once, I suggested rearranging the living room. Just a thought. Just an idea. She looked around, then back at me. "This works," she said. Nothing else. No discussion. No curiosity. I nodded and dropped it. That was easier. Another time I forgot to replace something in its usual place. She found it later and didn't say anything. But the air changed. Her movements became precise. Controlled. I apologized without knowing exactly why. She accepted it with a small nod. That nod stayed with me longer than the mistake. I began to feel like I was always one step behind an invisible expectation. Like there was a rulebook I hadn't been given, only corrected for violating. The resentment didn't explode. Seep. It showed up when I caught myself holding my breath. When I felt tired without reason. When I imagined conversations that never happened. I wondered how many pieces of myself I had trimmed away without noticing. How much of my energy went into keeping things smooth. And I wondered, quietly, guiltily, how long a person could absorb these moments before something inside them changed shape. The realization came on an ordinary afternoon. Sunlight fell across the floor in narrow lines. Dust floated lazily, unbothered by meaning. She made a comment, small offhand. Joke really. About how I overthink everything. She smiled when she said it. Like it was affectionate. Smiled back. Automatically. But something inside me didn't. I felt it then, the weight of all the small cuts, layered one over another. None deep enough to bleed. All deep enough to leave marks. I saw myself clearly for the first time in a while. The way I anticipated disappointment. The way I braced before speaking. The way I shrank my reactions to fit the room. This wasn't patience. This wasn't compromise. This was erosion. I didn't say anything in that moment. I just watched her turn away, already done with the sentence. And I understood something important. Resentment isn't loud. It's patient. It grows when pain goes unspoken. When understanding is one-sided. When kindness becomes a habit instead of a choice. I realized then that I was changing. Not into someone stronger. Someone quieter. Someone less visible. And I asked myself, maybe for the first time, who benefits from that? The answer didn't come with relief. But it came with honesty. That night, I stood at the window and watched the streetlight flicker. And again. The house behind me was quiet, settled into its familiar stillness. I touched the glass. It was cool. Solid. I thought about all the moments I'd let pass without acknowledgement. All the words I'd swallowed to keep the peace. All the small cuts I'd convinced myself didn't matter. They mattered. Not because they hurt individually, but because together they rewrote me. I stayed there longer than necessary, breathing evenly, letting the weight of that truth settle. Change doesn't always begin with confrontation. Sometimes it begins with recognition. And as the light steadied outside, I wondered what would happen when I finally stopped absorbing and started responding. The door closed behind me without a sound. I stood on the porch for a moment, keys still warm in my hand, listening to the quiet settle. The night air brushed my face, cool and clean like it didn't know me yet. The street was empty, stretched out under flickering lights that hummed softly, doing their job without complaint. I took a breath I hadn't planned on taking. It went deeper than the others. And for the first time that day, nothing inside me rushed to correct it. Outside, the world felt wider. Not kinder. Just more honest. The house behind me held its warmth and its rules, its pauses and expectations. Out here, there was no one watching how I stood or how long I lingered. No sighs waiting to be interpreted. No silence asking to be filled. I walked slowly down the steps and onto the pavement. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have, like the night was amplifying everything I did. The air smelled faintly of dust and damp concrete. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed and then disappeared. I realized how rarely I let myself step away like this. Not physically, I left the house all the time. But emotionally, mentally, I was usually still inside, replaying conversations, adjusting myself even in absence. That night something loosened. I felt tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Tired of carrying explanations no one asked for. Tired of smoothing edges that didn't belong to me. The anger I'd been avoiding sat quietly in my chest, no longer asking permission to exist. I'd been taught, by habit, by history, that anger was dangerous, that it ruined things, that it made you ungrateful. So I learned to swallow it, dress it up as patience, call it understanding. But standing there under a streetlight that flickered like it might give up at any moment, I let myself feel it. Not loud, not explosive, just real. I walked until the house was out of sight. The neighborhood slept early. Curtains drawn. Windows dark. The occasional car passed, tires whispering against the road. I stopped near a small patch of grass where the streetlight didn't quite reach. The shadows pooled there, soft and forgiving. I stood in them and let my shoulders drop. Anger came in pieces. Not rage, recognition. I thought about the words I'd swallowed over the years. The moments I'd chosen peace over honesty, even when peace cost me something. I thought about how often I'd felt misunderstood but said nothing, convinced myself it wasn't worth it. The silence outside didn't argue with me. It didn't minimize. It didn't explain anything away. Just listened. I clenched my hands, then relaxed them. The skin on my palms felt tight, like I'd been holding on too long. I realized I wasn't angry at her alone. I was angry at myself, for waiting this long to notice. A memory surfaced. Me standing in the kitchen months ago, wanting to say something simple. Wanting to say, that hurt. Instead I'd smiled and said nothing. The moment passed. The pattern continued. I felt the familiar urge to soften the anger, to make it more acceptable, to turn it into something smaller. I didn't. I let it sit beside me like a stranger on a bench. Uncomfortable. Necessary. And in that stillness, a question formed. Quiet but persistent. What would happen if I finally spoke my truth? The idea frightened me more than the anger ever had. Truth changes things. It rearranges rooms. It forces decisions. Once spoken, it doesn't belong to you anymore. I imagined the words leaving my mouth. Not accusations. Not rehearsed speeches. Just honesty. Clear. This hurts me. Feel unseen. I can't keep shrinking to make this work. My chest tightened. Not with fear but with possibility. I realized then that my silence hadn't been protecting anyone. It had just delayed the moment when something had to give. Every unspoken truth added weight to a future conversation I was already dreading. The night air moved again, rustling leaves somewhere nearby. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first time I didn't judge my anger. I didn't ask if it was justified enough. I didn't compare it to someone else's suffering. I let it be information. Anger, I understood, wasn't the opposite of love. It was a sign that something mattered. That a boundary had been crossed quietly, too many times. I opened my eyes and looked down the street, toward the direction of the house. Felt farther away now. Not physically but emotionally. I wasn't sure how the truth would land. I wasn't sure if it would be received or resisted. But I knew this. Not speaking it had already changed me. And I didn't want to become someone who disappeared just to keep things calm. I turned back slowly, retracing my steps. The streetlights buzzed overhead, steady again. My shadow moved ahead of me, stretching and shrinking with each step. When the house came back into view, it looked the same as it always had. Lights on. Curtains drawn. Waiting. I paused at the gate and rested my hand there, feeling the cool metal under my palm. The night air lingered on my skin, like it didn't want to let me go yet. I took one more breath. Deliberate. Inside, words were waiting. Not sharp, not loud, just honest. And as I stepped toward the door, I wondered whether truth would break the silence, or finally give it a voice. The door closed behind me with a softer sound than I expected. I stood there for a second, hand still on the knob, listening to the house take me back in. The night air clung to my clothes, cool and faintly metallic, like it wanted proof I'd been outside. Inside, the light was warm but thin. She stood near the counter, arms folded, eyes on something I couldn't see. I felt the words waiting in my chest. Quiet, arranged, heavier than breath. When I spoke, my voice didn't shake. That surprised me most. I hadn't planned a speech. I'd learned long ago that rehearsed words fall apart the moment they meet another person's silence. Instead, I focused on the room. The way the lamp leaned slightly to one side. The soft hum of the refrigerator. The faint mark on the wall where a frame used to hang. These details grounded me. They reminded me I was here. Present. Not floating somewhere above myself, watching from a safer distance. She didn't look at me right away. That was familiar. When things turned uncomfortable, her gaze often moved elsewhere. Toward a task, a surface, a thought she could control. Her arms stayed crossed. Not defensive exactly, but closed. Protective. I stood a few feet away, leaving space between us. Space had always helped me think. It felt important not to crowd the moment. I noticed how calm my body felt. My heart was steady. My hands were loose at my sides. The anger from outside hadn't followed me in. What remained was something quieter, clearer. I realized then that this wasn't about winning or being right. It was about being honest without apologizing for it. The house held its breath. I wasn't trying to be your mother, I said. The words landed gently. No edge. No accusation. She shifted her weight slightly but said nothing. I don't think I could be, I added. Even if I wanted to. Her eyes flicked toward me for just a moment, then away again. Kept going. When you compare me to her, sometimes directly, sometimes not, it wears me down. I don't always notice it right away. But it stays. I watched her face carefully. Not for agreement. Just for presence. I've spent a long time wondering what I'm doing wrong, I said. Trying to figure out how to be better. Or closer to whatever you need. The room felt smaller as the words filled it. Not tighter. Just more defined. She uncrossed her arms, then crossed them again. Habit. Something she did when she was listening but didn't want to be seen doing it. I know you admire her, I said. I understand that. I really do. Pause. Let the silence do some work. But I'm not her. And I don't want to spend my life feeling like I'm being measured against someone who isn't here. She inhaled sharp and quick. Her jaw tightened. I didn't rush to soften what I'd said. I stayed still. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator clicked off. The quiet felt heavier without it. I didn't mean it that way, she said finally. Her voice was controlled. Careful. I know, I replied. That seemed to throw her off. She looked at me then, really looked. Like she was searching for the argument she expected and couldn't find. I'm not saying you're doing this on purpose, I continued. I'm saying this is how it feels on my side. She turned away, took a step toward the window, then stopped. Her shoulders rose and fell once. I talk about her because she mattered to me, she said. I know, I said again. And she mattered. That doesn't disappear. I waited before saying the next part. Not because I was afraid, but because timing matters when the truth is fragile. But I matter too, I said quietly. The words hung there bare. She didn't respond right away. She rubbed her thumb along the edge of the counter, back and forth, like she was sanding something down. I didn't realize it was that bad, she said. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was something. I felt a shift inside me, not relief exactly. More like alignment. Like I had finally stood where my feet had been trying to take me all along. I don't need you to stop remembering her, I said. I just need you to see me as myself, not as a comparison. She nodded once, more uncertain. I couldn't tell if she was hearing me, or just preparing her response. I understood then that this conversation wouldn't finish itself tonight. Some things take longer to settle. But the important part had already happened. I had said it aloud. Later we stood in the same room doing separate things. She rinsed a glass. I picked up a book I wasn't ready to read. The distance between us remained, but it felt different now. Less sharp. The house resumed its usual sounds. Familiar. Steady. I watched her for a moment. The way she moved, thoughtful, contained. I wondered what she was carrying now. Whether my words had found a place to land, or whether they were still circling. I didn't push. I didn't fill the space. When I turned off the light and headed down the hall, my steps felt firmer, quieter, like they belonged to me again. Some truths don't fix things right away. But once spoken, they change the shape of the silence. And as I lay down in the dark, listening to the house settle, I wondered what would come next. Understanding. Or resistance. The clock on the wall kept time the way it always did. Soft, patient, unconcerned. Each tick felt louder than the last. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of the moment press down without touching me. She stood near the window this time, the curtain breathing in and out beside her. The room looked ordinary. Too ordinary for what was happening inside it. When she spoke, her voice was calm, reasonable. And somehow that made it harder to stay where I was. I had known this part was coming. It always did. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just enough to tilt the ground under my feet. I didn't mean it like that, she said, not turning around. The words were familiar. They had lived in this house longer than I had. I could almost see them settling into the corners, into the grooves of the furniture. I nodded once, even though she couldn't see me. My body remembered the old steps. The apology waiting just behind my teeth. The urge to smooth things over before they cut too deep. The light outside the window was fading. Evening had a way of softening everything. Edges, colors, expectations. I watched dust float through the air, catching what little light remained. It felt like the room was slowing down on purpose. I was just talking, she continued. You're reading too much into it. There it was. Minimizing. Redirecting. Not denial exactly. Something gentler. More confusing. I pressed my feet into the floor. The wood was cool, solid. It creaked faintly, like it remembered other moments just like this one. I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch. That was new. Inside, something restless stirred. A voice that said, just explain it better. Another that said, say you're sorry. Make it easier. Focused on my breath instead. Low. The room waited with me. He turned then, finally. Leaned against the back of the chair. Arms folded, not tight but closed enough. You know I'm not trying to hurt you, she said. Her tone was even. Almost kind. I talk like that with everyone. I studied her face. The careful way she held herself. The practiced steadiness. She wasn't lying. That was the hardest part. I can't always be watching every word, she added. That's not fair. Felt the pull then. Stronger. The old gravity tugging me forward. She has a point. You're being sensitive. You don't want this to turn into a fight. My mouth opened slightly. Closed again. I noticed my hands were shaking. Just a little. I tucked them under my thighs, grounding them there. The silence thickened. Not uncomfortable for her yet. Just noticeable. She shifted, clearing her throat. I think you're taking it personally when it's not meant that way, she said. I watched the way her eyes flicked toward the door. An exit. Not physical. Emotional. I swallowed. Everything in me wanted to rescue the moment. To say something reassuring. To take responsibility for the tension like I always did. Instead I stayed quiet. The clock kept ticking. Standing still felt harder than giving in. That surprised me. My chest tightened not with anger, but with effort. Like holding a door closed against a steady wind. She exhaled sharply. Say something, she said. Not harshly. Just tired. I looked up at her then. Really looked. I hear what you're saying, I said slowly. The words felt careful. Measured. But I need a minute. Her eyebrows lifted. Just slightly. A minute for what? She asked. To not disappear, I said. The sentence slipped out before I could shape it. Unpolished. She frowned. Confused. I'm not asking you to disappear, she said. I know, I replied. But that's what happens. I fold myself smaller so the moment passes. Her arms loosened. Dropped to her sides. That's not on me, she said quietly. He nodded. I know that too. Another pause. But it is on me, I continued. To stop doing it. The room felt different then. Not lighter. More honest. She sat down slowly, as if the chair had suddenly gained weight. I didn't realize you felt that way, she said. There it was again. Not an apology. Not resistance either. Something in between. I felt something shift inside my chest. Small release. Like I'd been holding my breath without knowing it. I'm not saying you're wrong, I said. I'm saying I can't keep stepping back every time you step forward. She looked at her hands. Turned them over. Me. For a moment, neither of us tried to fix anything. And that felt new. Later, the house settled into its nighttime shape. Lamps off. Corners darkened. Familiar sounds returning. She moved around the kitchen quietly. I stayed where I was listening. The clink of a spoon. The low rush of water. Ordinary things. Nothing had been resolved. Not really. But something had been interrupted. The pattern hadn't finished its usual loop. Stopped halfway. Awkward. Uncertain. When she passed me in the hallway, our shoulders almost touched. Almost. A pause. Not long enough to speak. Long enough to think. I lay in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, tracing old cracks with my eyes. My body felt tired in a good way. Like after carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. Resistance, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it's just choosing not to move. And as the clock continued its patient ticking down the hall, I wondered how long this stillness could hold. Before one of us reached for the old way again. The morning came in quietly, like it didn't want to wake anyone. Pale light slipped through the thin curtains and settled on the floor in uneven shapes. I stood at the sink, hands resting on the edge, watching steam rise from my cup and disappear. The house was still. No footsteps. No voices. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. I knew even then that this was not going to be a loud day. It was going to be careful. The kind of day where something small is said. And nothing goes back to where it was before. I had practiced the words in my head, but they never sounded right there. Too sharp. Too neat. Real words were messier. They came with pauses and second thoughts. She was sitting at the table when I turned around, reading something on her phone. Glasses low on her nose. The familiar picture of her, framed by years of mornings just like this one. Did you sleep? She asked without looking up. Some, I said. That was true. Not enough. But more than before. I sat across from her. The chair made a soft sound as it pulled back like a sigh. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my palms. Steadied me. The air between us felt thin. Like a line already drawn, faint but visible, waiting to be traced over. I noticed things I usually didn't. A small crack in the wall behind her. A loose thread at the edge of her sleeve. The way her jaw tightened when she scrolled. These details had always been here. I just hadn't needed them before. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I had expected anger to lead the way. Instead, there was a calm heaviness. The kind that comes after a decision has already been made somewhere deep inside. She looked up then. Met my eyes. You're quiet, she said. He nodded. I'm thinking. She waited. That was new too. I need to say something, I said. My voice sounded like my own. That was another surprise. She set her phone down slowly. folded her hands on the table, gave me her full attention or something close to it. "Okay," she said. Took a breath. Felt it catch halfway in. "I'm not asking you to change who you are," I began. "I just need to change what I allow." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not defensive. Curious. Careful. "What does that mean?" she asked. I looked down at my hands. At the faint lines across my knuckles. Proof of years spent gripping things too tightly. "It means," I said, choosing each word, "that I can't accept being compared anymore. Not to your past. Not to who you think I should be." She leaned back in her chair. "I don't compare you," she said quickly. I know," I said gently. "And I'm not saying you mean harm. But intention doesn't erase impact." The words felt unfamiliar in my mouth. Like a new language I was still learning to speak. She exhaled through her nose. Looked away. "I've always talked like that," she said. "You never said it bothered you." "I didn't know how," I replied. "And now I do." The room went quiet again. Not the comfortable quiet of shared routine. Something sharper. More alert. I stayed where I was. Didn't rush to soften it. Didn't reach for reassurance. That too felt like drawing a line. She studied me then. Really studied me. Like she was seeing the shape of me instead of the role I filled. "You sound different," she said. I almost smiled. "I feel different," I answered. She shook her head slightly. "This feels like an ultimatum." "It's not," I said. "It's information." Her mouth opened then closed again. "I'm telling you what I will step away from," I continued. "Not what you have to stop doing." She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. Rested her hands flat on the table. "And if I don't?" she asked. The question hovered between us. I felt the weight of it. The old fear tried to rise. The instinct to retreat. To say, then never mind. Forget I said anything. Instead I stayed still. "Then I'll take space," I said quietly. "From the conversation. From the moment. Maybe more." Her eyes flickered. Uncertainty passed through them. Quick but unmistakable. "You'd really do that?" she asked. I nodded once. "I already am." That landed. She looked at me like she was measuring something. Not my words. My resolve. "This is new," she said. "No," I replied. "It's just visible now." For a moment she didn't speak. The silence stretched, but it didn't strain. Settled. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for her approval. Or her understanding. I had already crossed something inside myself. And that was enough. Later I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and distant traffic. Clouds moved slowly across the sky, unbothered by human lines and boundaries. Behind me, the door opened and closed softly. She didn't follow. Not yet. I rested my hands on the railing. The wood was rough. Solid. Real. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of something fragile. Felt planted. Change, I was learning, doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stillness that refuses to bend. I stayed there as the light shifted, waiting to see what would come next. Not from her, but from me. The house smelled of cold coffee and faint dust. Light spilled through the half-closed blinds in thin stripes across the floorboards. I sat on the edge of the couch, my fingers tracing the grain of the wooden armrest. Outside, the wind moved lazily through bare branches, tapping softly against the window. It was quiet, too quiet, but in that quiet everything was clearer. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and unhurried, and it reminded me that nothing had broken completely. The conversation had ended hours ago, yet the echoes lingered, small vibrations in the air that refused to fade. I remembered the way she had looked at me just before leaving the room. Not angry, not apologetic, but still. There had been no fireworks, no last words hurled across the table, no dramatic exit. Only the soft click of the door and a space suddenly larger than it had been before. I sat there alone and realized I wasn't defeated. The relief was quiet, subtle, like a breath I didn't know I had been holding. The weight of years of unspoken thoughts and folded emotions seemed to lift slightly, though the room still carried traces of tension. I traced patterns in the dust on the armrest with my finger, noticing how the sunlight made them shine faintly. Tiny details, overlooked before, felt vivid now. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft groan of the floorboards under the couch, even the distant drone of traffic outside. Everything was louder in its own way because nothing was being forced to compete with raised voices or hurried footsteps. I thought about the space between us. Not empty, not hostile, just quiet. It was a new kind of stillness, one I could breathe into. And yet, the question lingered. What would grow here now, in this space where silence once lived? I stood slowly, letting my weight shift from one foot to the other. The floor creaked like it remembered every conversation that had passed over it. I moved to the kitchen, poured myself a second cup of coffee, the liquid steaming and curling in the morning light. I didn't drink it yet. I just held the warmth between my hands and listened. Each sound was amplified in the calm. The kettle ticking, the wind brushing against the window pane, the faint creak of the refrigerator door as it settled. Every noise was a small anchor to reality, grounding me in the present instead of the past. I wandered back to the living room and picked up a book from the coffee table. Its spine cracked softly as I opened it, the paper scent sharp and familiar. I didn't read the words. I just let the texture of the pages rest against my fingertips. In some way, it was enough, proof that the world remained intact, even if the conversation had shifted something inside me. I thought about her silence, the way she had folded her arms, the slight tilt of her head. The uncertainty in her eyes lingered in my memory, a quiet echo that felt both accusing and curious. I realized I wasn't angry. Not really. Only aware. Aware that our old patterns had been disrupted, and that disruption, strange as it felt, was necessary. I moved to the window and looked out at the street. Shadows stretched long across the pavement. A single car passed, its headlights illuminating the edges of the branches. For the first time, I felt like I could watch life move outside without needing to be swept along with it. That thought was strange but welcome. I sank back onto the couch, letting the cushions envelop me. My hands rested in my lap, still warm from the coffee mug I had abandoned. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was fertile, full of potential. I thought about all the things I had wanted to say over the years and hadn't. About the comparisons, the subtle criticisms, the quiet weight of expectation. All of it had been there, yes, but now it felt like it could exist without breaking me. I had seen the line I had drawn, and it wasn't just on the floor or in the air. It was inside me. Firm. Clear. Unmovable. The house creaked again. A floorboard in the hallway, a reminder of the passage of time. And I realized something. The quiet wasn't a threat. It wasn't a pause before conflict. It was a space I could inhabit safely. A place to see myself, unfiltered. I thought about the possibility of reconciliation. Or maybe just understanding. Not the kind that comes from words, but from acknowledgement. From seeing each other as we truly were, rather than as echoes of the past. And I wondered if she would find that space too, if she would allow herself to feel the absence of argument without filling it with blame. For the first time, I could imagine a future that wasn't tense. A future where our interactions weren't a battlefield, but a landscape of quiet, careful growth. And that thought carried a weight I could hold without fear. The afternoon light shifted through the blinds, softening the stripes on the floor. I sipped my coffee finally, letting it warm my chest and fingers. Outside, the wind moved with gentle insistence, brushing the branches and scattering the last leaves of winter across the lawn. I sat back, closing my eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, not to escape, but to let the quiet settle into me fully. There was sadness lingering in the corners, yes, but it was tempered with relief. A sense that the space between us, empty before, was no longer something to fear. It was a place where clarity could grow. And I knew, quietly, without needing to speak it aloud, that the next step would come, in its own time. For now I just breathed, and listened. The silence finally felt like home. The morning light came soft, almost shy, through the blinds. I ran my hand across the counter, feeling the slight grit of dust that had settled overnight. The kettle's faint whistle blended with the hum of the refrigerator. I paused, just standing there, noticing the weight in my shoulders felt different. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. The reflection in the window caught my eye for a moment, and I didn't flinch. I saw a person who had existed in fragments for too long. Someone who had been trying to fit into a mold never meant for them. Today, the shape felt less important than the presence. I breathed and let myself simply be. The house smelled faintly of brewed coffee and warm toast, ordinary and grounding. I moved deliberately from room to room, noticing how the sunlight pooled on the hardwood floor, how the shadows of the blinds cut across the rug like gentle lines of instruction. My movements were slower than usual, unhurried. I stopped reaching for approval in every gesture, every glance. For years, I had tried to mirror her expectations, to anticipate the comparisons, to step quietly into a version of myself she seemed to prefer. I remembered the old reflections: stiff shoulders, tense hands, half smiles forced into shapes of mimicry. But now the tension had loosened. I let my hands fall naturally to my sides, let my voice settle into its own rhythm when I spoke to myself aloud in the kitchen. I lingered by the window, watching neighbors start their day. The sounds of small life, dogs barking, a mailbox clanging, tires rolling over asphalt, felt like music I had forgotten existed. For a moment, I imagined moving through the world without trying to measure myself against anyone else. The thought was fragile, but it had weight. I brushed my hair back from my face and caught my own reflection again, this time without recoil. The face looking back at me belonged to me alone. Not her, not anyone else. Just me. I walked to the mirror in the bedroom, letting my fingers trail along the wooden frame. Sunlight caught the glass at an angle, and for a second, I felt the pulse of the house around me. Soft, patient, waiting. I studied the lines of my face, the slight curve of my jaw, the way my eyes held quiet determination. No comparison. No judgment. Just observation. I thought about the days and nights spent absorbing subtle critiques, the little sighs, the smiles that never fully reached her eyes. They had shaped me, yes, but only until now. Now the shape of me was mine. I touched my reflection gently, as though testing if it was real. The person staring back nodded softly, without words. Later I moved through small routines differently. The kettle whistled, and I didn't hurry. I poured my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth. I dressed deliberately, choosing comfort and intention rather than presentation for anyone else. The floorboards creaked under my careful steps, and I smiled faintly at their familiar protest. I was learning a rhythm that was my own, one that required neither her approval nor her acknowledgement. I thought about the first day I realized I didn't have to imitate her mother, or anyone else, to be enough. That day, the reflection in the mirror had startled me. Now it brought quiet recognition. Recognition that I existed not as a comparison, but as a full, breathing person. In the afternoons, I began to test small freedoms. A phrase left unsaid, a gesture not offered for validation, a decision made quietly for myself. Felt strange at first. The tension of old habits tugged at me, whispering doubts. Could I truly allow myself this space? Could I move through life without measuring, without bending? I noticed my posture change. Shoulders lowered, chest open, hands relaxed. The air seemed softer around me, lighter, carrying less expectation. And in the silence of the evening, I recognized a new sensation. Self-possession. Not arrogance. Not rebellion. Just ownership of my own presence. I caught myself smiling alone in the kitchen, the way a person might smile at a small, private miracle. I realized the house no longer felt like a courtroom, no longer measured every movement. The creak of the floors, the hum of appliances, even the distant wind, all were companions rather than witnesses. I looked in the mirror again. This time I didn't study, didn't evaluate, only saw. I saw someone who had endured subtle storms and survived them. Someone who had learned patience and courage not through grand gestures, but through standing still in quiet moments. And in that recognition, I felt the smallest spark of something new. Confidence. Maybe. Or maybe just acceptance. For the first time, I allowed myself to think that being nothing like her mother wasn't a flaw. It was merely being me. Evening settled gently across the house, painting the walls in soft amber. I stood by the window, watching the last rays of sun glint through the trees. The street was calm, the sounds of distant life muted but alive. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth that seemed to seep deeper than the skin. I touched the reflection in the window, barely a whisper of glass between me and the world. For the first time I didn't recoil. I didn't compare. I only stood, only existed, only acknowledged. And in that simple act, breathing, seeing, being, I realized that standing up isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it begins quietly, with recognition. A deliberate step into oneself. I turned away from the window, letting the night settle around me, knowing the next day would bring its own challenges, but feeling ready. At last I was becoming myself.